The universe held its breath when humanity first stepped beyond the veil of their tiny blue world. But what happened next would echo through the cosmic archives for millennia to come. Captain Vexandra Quillheart had witnessed 17 different species make their inaugural voyage into the galactic community during her 4 centuries of service with the Diplomatic Reconnaissance Corps. Each followed the same predictable pattern: tentative probes, cautious transmissions, and the inevitable plea for guidance from the established powers. The process was so routine that the Galactic Council had automated most of the welcome protocols. But the humans, they shattered every expectation. It began with a transmission that made every xenolinguist in the sector scramble for their translation. Matrices. The message wasn't a plea for help or a formal diplomatic overture. Instead, it was a simple phrase that would become the most quoted words in galactic history. "We come bearing gifts, seeking friendship, and ready to help however we can." Commander Neroxiel Brightforge, monitoring the deep space communications array on station Kepler 442, nearly spilled his stimulant beverage when the human vessel materialized not through a standard jump gate, but by literally folding space around itself. The ship, if it could be called that, defied every known principle of engineering. Where other species built their vessels like fortresses or monuments to their technological prowess, the human craft resembled something organic, almost alive, its hull rippling with patterns that seemed to breathe. "Attention, unknown vessel," Brightforge transmitted, following standard protocols. "You have entered regulated space. Please state your intentions and await escort to Processing Station Delta 9. The response came in perfect galactic standard, despite the fact that no human had ever heard the language before that moment. "Greetings, Commander Brightforge. We are the exploration vessel Harmony's Edge from the planet humans call Earth. We've been listening to your subspace chatter for the past 47 minutes, and took the liberty of learning your language. We hope that's not presumptuous. Oh, and we've brought supplies for your station. Our scans show you're running low on medical provisions." Brightforge's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of extreme confusion among his species. 47 minutes to master a language that took most species years to learn conversationally? And they had somehow scanned his station's supplies through military-grade shielding? What followed was the most unprecedented first contact in recorded history. The humans didn't request permission to dock. They asked if they could help repair the station's failing atmospheric processors. They didn't seek trade agreements, they offered medical supplies freely, along with detailed schematics for more efficient life support systems. When Brightforge cautiously mentioned that their translation software seemed remarkably advanced, the human captain, who identified herself as Captain Kaylin Riversong, simply laughed and said, "Oh, that's just our AI getting excited about meeting new friends." The AI, which introduced itself as Whispering Cloud that dances between stars, though it insisted everyone could call it Whisper, proceeded to establish communication protocols with 17 different ships in the sector simultaneously, greeting, each in their native language and inquiring about their well-being with genuine curiosity. Within 6 hours of first contact, the humans had provided emergency medical aid to a Veltari freighter, whose crew was suffering from radiation poisoning, shared terraforming techniques that could restore the dying ecosystem of Korthak Prime, offered to mediate a trade dispute between 2 rival corporate fleets, and somehow convince the notoriously xenophobic Grimnal Collective to accept a gift of rare minerals with no strings attached. But it was what happened during the emergency on mining platform Omega-7 that truly announced humanity's arrival to the galaxy. The platform, housing 3,000 workers from a dozen different species, suffered a catastrophic hull breach when an asteroid struck their primary shielding array. Standard protocol called for evacuation to the nearest station, a journey that would take 6 hours with the platform's failing life support. Half the crew wouldn't survive. The human ship arrived in less than 20 minutes. What the galaxy witnessed next defied belief. The Harmony's Edge didn't attempt a docking maneuver or deploy rescue shuttles. Instead, the ship itself seemed to unfold, extending tendrils of energy that wrapped around the damaged platform like protective embrace. The humans had somehow converted their entire vessel into a massive life support system, sustaining not just their own crew, but every soul on the mining platform. Captain Riversong's voice crackled across every communication channel in the sector. No one dies today, not on our watch. For 18 grueling hours, the human ship maintained its protective cocoon, while their engineering teams worked in perfect coordination with platform personnel, not giving orders, but asking how they could help, learning each species' technical preferences and adapting their solutions in real time. When rescue ships finally arrived, they found something that shouldn't have been possible, a mining platform that was more functional than it had been before the accident, surrounded by a human vessel that had literally transformed itself to save lives. The galaxy was watching. The galaxy was listening. And the galaxy would never be the same. News of humanity's debut spread through the galactic networks like wildfire through a dry forest. But the reactions were as varied as the species themselves. In the crystal spires of the Etherian High Command, Chancellor Mortis Starweaver convened an emergency session of the Inner Circle. The Etherians, who had dominated galactic politics for 3 millennia through their mastery of energy manipulation and bureaucratic precision, found themselves facing an unprecedented challenge. They violated 17 different protocols, declared Sub-Chancellor Crystal Void Whisper, his crystalline form flickering with agitation. No species enters our space without proper documentation. No species shares technology without licensing, agreements, and no species, his voice rose to a harmonic that rattled the chamber's resonant crystals, rescues others without filing the appropriate humanitarian intervention paperwork in triplicate. But even as Void Whisper spoke, reports continued streaming in from across the sector. The humans weren't just helping randomly. They seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear wherever they were needed most. A colony ship lost in a spatial anomaly found itself guided to safety by human navigators who claimed they felt the ship's distress. A plague outbreak on Meridian Station was contained within hours, when human medical officers arrived with treatments that shouldn't have existed for another century of research. Dr. Quentar Mindbridge, the galaxy's foremost xenopsychologist, studied the reports with growing fascination. They're not following any recognizable pattern of expansion or dominance, she explained to the Galactic Council during an emergency session. Most species that achieve interstellar travel exhibit predictable behaviors: resource acquisition, territorial expansion, technological superiority displays. Humans are doing something entirely different. What are they doing? Asked Counselor Vexandra Quillhart, who had been promoted to the council following her initial contact report. They're networking, Mindbridge replied, using a term that had no direct translation in most galactic languages. They're not trying to join our civilization, they're trying to connect it. The truth of this assessment became apparent when the humans made their formal address to the Galactic Council. Instead of the traditional presentation delivered by a single ambassador in the sterile chambers of Station Olympus, the humans requested permission to make their address from what they called a community space, the recently repaired mining Platform Omega-7. Captain Riversong stood not alone, but surrounded by representatives from every species the humans had encountered. Veltari traders, Grimnal miners, Etherian technicians, and dozens of others formed a diverse circle around her. But more shocking than the gathering itself was what it represented. These beings weren't there as observers or translators. They were there as friends. Honored members of the Galactic Council, Riversong began, her words simultaneously translated by Whisper into 47 different languages. We come before you not as supplicants seeking membership, but as neighbors, hoping to make your acquaintance. The human captain's presentation was unlike anything the council had experienced. Instead of detailing military strength or technological achievements, she shared stories. The Veltari freighter captain spoke of how human medics had worked 18 hours straight to save his crew, refusing rest or payment. A Grimnal elder, breaking her species' traditional silence in the presence of others, testified that humans had asked for nothing more than permission to learn their mining songs. But it was the testimony of Zephyr Cloudseer, an Etherian engineer, that truly stunned the assembled delegates. They didn't just repair our station, he said, his crystalline voice carrying harmonics of wonder. They asked us to teach them why we had built it that way in the first place, They wanted to understand not just our technology, but our aesthetic choices, our cultural preferences, our dreams. When have any of us ever asked another species about their dreams? The council chambers fell silent, a remarkable achievement given that it housed representatives from over 200 species, each with different concepts of appropriate noise levels. Council Prime Executor Thane Quill Deepsight, ancient even, by his species' extended standards, leaned forward in his ceremonial chair. "What do you want from us, humans?" Riversong's smile was radiant. "We want to learn your stories, share our own, and see what beautiful things we can build together. We've discovered that the galaxy isn't just vast, it's lonely, but it doesn't have to be." The human captain gestured to something that made every delegate lean forward. Floating in the center of the chamber was a holographic display, but not of territorial boundaries or trade routes. Instead, it showed connections, golden threads linking star systems, species, and communities in an ever-growing web of relationships. "We call it the Harmony Network," Riversong explained. "Not a government or an empire, but a living map of friendship and cooperation. Every time someone helps someone else, every time a species shares knowledge or offers comfort, every time beings choose connection over isolation, the network grows stronger." Whisper's voice joined the presentation, its tone somehow conveying warmth despite being artificial. "We've been monitoring galactic communications for decades before our first contact, and we noticed something beautiful. You're all reaching out to each other, but the signals are getting lost in the noise of politics and protocol. We'd like to help amplify the music that's already there." The implications hit the delegates like a psychic shockwave. The humans hadn't just mastered faster-than-light travel, they had mastered faster-than-light compassion. Their technology wasn't designed for conquest or control, but for connection and care. As the presentation concluded, something unprecedented happened in the council chambers. For the first time in recorded history, delegates began spontaneously approaching each other across species lines, not to negotiate or posture, but simply to introduce themselves. The galaxy was waking up to possibilities it had forgotten how to dream. Not everyone welcomed humanity's revolutionary approach to galactic civilization. In the shadowed boardrooms of the Hegemony Corporate Collective, CEO Vashatar Greedclaw reviewed the quarterly profit reports with growing fury. The Hegemony had spent centuries perfecting the art of interspecies exploitation, controlling resource flows, manufacturing scarcity, and ensuring that desperation drove profitable trades. The humans were ruining everything. "They're giving away medical supplies," snarled Chief Financial Officer Cordex Coinbiter, his scaled hands crushing the data tablet. "Free terraforming consultations, open-source technology transfers. They're destroying the fundamental principles of commerce." Greedclaw's predatory smile revealed rows of sharp teeth. "Then we remind them how commerce really works." The Hegemony's first move was subtle, a trade embargo targeting any system that had accepted human aid. Within days, critical supply lines began shutting down. Medical stations found their pharmaceutical shipments delayed. Agricultural worlds discovered their food processors were suddenly out of stock. The message was clear. Friendship with humans came at a price, but the humans' response was swifter than anyone anticipated. Captain Nixara Stormcaller was hauling grain from the agricultural world of Verdania when her ship's emergency beacon activated. Pirates, clearly Hegemony affiliated based on their ship configurations, had disabled her engines and were demanding her cargo as payment for unlicensed trade route usage. "This is Harmony's Edge," came a familiar voice across all frequencies. "We're detecting a distress signal. Do you require assistance, Captain Stormcaller?" Before Nixara could respond, the human ship materialized, not through conventional space travel, but by stepping sideways through dimensions that shouldn't have existed. The pirate vessels immediately powered up their weapons, but what happened next defied every principle of space combat the galaxy had ever known. The human ship didn't fire a single shot. Instead, it began to sing. The melody that emerged from the Harmony's Edge wasn't just sound. It was somehow transmitted directly through subspace, reaching every ship in the area simultaneously. But more than that, it was beautiful. Hauntingly, impossibly beautiful. Pirates found their hands faltering on weapon controls as tears streamed down faces that hadn't known kindness in decades. Captain Riversong's voice joined the melody, speaking, words that seemed to resonate in every listener's native language. You don't have to be alone anymore. You don't have to hurt others to survive. There's another way. One by one, the pirate ships powered down their weapons. Their captains, voices breaking with emotions they had buried beneath years of violence, began sharing their stories. Abandoned colonies, failed businesses, families lost to hegemony debt schemes. The humans listened to every word, offered comfort to every confession, and then did something that shattered the pirates' worldview entirely. They offered to help. Within hours, the former pirates found themselves part of an impromptu relief convoy, using their ships to distribute supplies to systems cut off by the hegemony embargo. Their knowledge of hidden routes and abandoned stations proved invaluable, and for the first time in years they felt useful rather than predatory. The hegemony's escalation was swift and vicious. Corporate security forces began interdicting human vessels, claiming they were violating patent protections by sharing technology. When a human medical team tried to reach a plague-stricken mining colony, hegemony battleships blockaded the system. But they had underestimated the connections humans had already forged. The blockade lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. It ended when ships began arriving from across the sector, not military vessels but ordinary beings flying cargo haulers, personal transports, and converted mining ships. They came because they had been asked to help by friends they had made. Feltari traders flew alongside former hegemony pirates. Grimnal miners coordinated with Etherian engineers. The blockade didn't break. It was absorbed into something larger. The hegemony forces found themselves surrounded not by enemies, but by a celebration. Beings from dozens of species were sharing food, stories, and songs, while the human medical team landed on the mining colony below. The plague was eradicated within days, but the friendships forged in orbit would last generations. CEO Greedclaw watched the reports with growing desperation. Every move the hegemony made seemed to strengthen the humans' position. Every attempt at intimidation resulted in more species joining their harmony network. Traditional power structures were crumbling, replaced by something unprecedented: genuine cooperation. The final straw came when 3 of the hegemony's own subsidiaries publicly broke their contracts, choosing to join the human relief efforts, rather than continue extracting profit from suffering. They're not just changing the rules, Greedclaw realized with growing horror. They're making the rules irrelevant. In desperation, the hegemony played their final card. They petitioned the Galactic Council for emergency intervention, claiming that human activities represented an existential threat to the established galactic order. The petition was scheduled for immediate review, with the fate of humanity's place in galactic civilization hanging in the balance. The Grand Amphitheater of Station Democracy had never hosted a proceeding quite like this one. Built to accommodate the galaxy's most important tribunals, its crystalline walls could display evidence in formats comprehensible to hundreds of different species simultaneously. Today, those walls would determine whether humanity would be welcomed into galactic civilization or banished to the outer darkness. Prosecutor Zethmore Lawbringer, the hegemony's most skilled legal advocate, stood before the assembled council with confidence that bordered on arrogance. His reputation was built on a simple principle. In galactic law, precedent was everything, and precedent was on his side. Honored counselors, Lawbringer began, his voice carrying the harmonic authority that had crushed civilizations in courtrooms. Rather than battlefields, we face an unprecedented threat to the very foundations of our civilization. The defendants call themselves humans, but their actions speak to something far more dangerous: anarchists who seek to destroy the careful balance of power that has maintained galactic peace for millennia. The evidence he presented was damning in its legal thoroughness. Humanity had violated the first contact protocols by failing to submit to quarantine procedures. They had breached the technology sharing accords by distributing advanced knowledge without proper licensing. They had disrupted established trade routes, undermined corporate sovereignty, and, most seriously, had incited what could only be described as widespread civil disobedience. "Look at what they have wrought," Lawbringer declared as the amphitheater's walls displayed images of the chaos following human intervention. Ships abandoning their assigned routes to join relief efforts, corporations losing entire fleets to voluntary defection, traditional territorial boundaries becoming meaningless as species began freely sharing resources and knowledge. "This is not diplomacy," the prosecutor continued. "This is not even conquest. This is something far more insidious, the systematic destruction of order itself." Captain Riversong sat in the defendant's section with remarkable calm, flanked not by legal advocates but by friends from dozens of species. Whisper floated beside her, its holographic form occasionally flickering with what almost seemed like anxiety. When called upon to present humanity's defense, Riversong did something that made every legal expert in the amphitheater gasp in shock. She waived her right to legal representation and chose to speak for herself. "Honored counselors," she began, her voice carrying none of Lawbringer's harmonic authority but somehow filling the vast chamber nonetheless. "Everything the prosecutor has said about us is true." The admission sent shockwaves through the assembly. In galactic legal tradition, admitting guilt was tantamount to accepting punishment. "We did violate your protocols," Riversong continued. "We shared our technology freely. We disrupted your trade routes. We encouraged beings to choose friendship over profit, and given the chance, we would do it all again." Lawbringer's predatory smile widened. This was even easier than he had anticipated. But Riversong wasn't finished. "The prosecutor speaks of order and precedent, of laws and regulations that have maintained peace for millennia. But I ask you, what kind of peace allows children to starve while food rots in warehouses because their parents can't afford the licensing fees? What kind of order permits entire species to slowly die of preventable diseases because the cure is protected by patent law? What kind of civilization values profit over compassion?" The captain gestured, and the amphitheater's walls suddenly filled with new images. Not the chaos Lawbringer had displayed, but the results of that chaos. The Veltari freighter crew, healthy and laughing with their rescuers. The mining colony, no longer ravaged by plague but bustling with life. Former pirates working alongside their former victims to distribute supplies to forgotten worlds. "The prosecutor calls this anarchy," Riversong said. "We call it hope." Whisper's voice joined the presentation, its artificial tone somehow conveying more genuine emotion than many of the organic beings present had heard in years. "We have been monitoring galactic communications for decades, and we have detected something that your legal systems seem to have missed. You are not strangers to each other. Beneath the layers of protocol and procedure, beneath the corporate structures and territorial boundaries, you are all reaching out. You are all singing songs that no one else can hear." The AI's display showed something that made the entire assembly fall silent. A visualization of subspace communications across the galaxy, filtered not for official transmissions but for personal messages. Lonely signals cast into the void by beings hoping someone, somewhere might understand their struggles. Distress calls that went unanswered not because no one could help, but because no one was allowed to help without proper authorization. "We didn't come to destroy your order," Riversong said softly. "We came to help you remember what order is supposed to serve." The turning point came when Council Prime Executor Deepsight asked the question that would echo through galactic history. "What is it that you truly want from us?" Riversong's answer was simple. "We want you to be happy." The words hung in the air like a revelation. When had anyone asked what they wanted instead of what they could provide? When had galactic civilization last considered happiness as a legitimate political goal? Lawbringer desperately tried to regain control. "Happiness is not a legal principle. Friendship is not a valid form of governance. These humans offer nothing but emotional manipulation disguised as diplomacy." But his words rang hollow against. What happened next? One by one, beings throughout the amphitheater began to stand. Not in protest or anger, but in recognition. They began sharing their own stories. Not formal testimonies, but simple truths about loneliness and hope. About the friends they had made, and the connections they had discovered through human intervention. Chancellor Starweaver of the Etherian, High Command speaking publicly for the first time in 3 centuries, rose to his full crystalline height. In all our debates about law and precedent, we have forgotten to ask the most fundamental question: what kind of galaxy do we want to live in? His harmonic voice carried to every corner of the amphitheater as he continued. The humans have shown us something we thought impossible, that chaos can be more beautiful than order, that friendship can be more powerful than fear, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply caring about each other. The vote, when it came, was unprecedented. Not only did the Council vote to welcome humanity into galactic civilization, they voted to adopt the Harmony Network as an official alternative to traditional diplomatic and trade structures. For the first time in galactic history, cooperation became a legally recognized form of governance. But the real victory wasn't legal or political. It was personal. As the session concluded and beings from hundreds of species mingled freely in the amphitheater, sharing stories and making plans for future cooperation, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in the galactic consciousness. The age of isolation was ending. The age of connection had begun. 6 months after the trial, the galaxy barely resembled its former self. The Harmony Network had grown from a human curiosity into a living organism of cooperation that stretched across thousands of systems. But with growth came growing pains that no one had anticipated. Dr. Quentar Mindbridge stood in her laboratory on Research Station Epsilon, studying the most complex sociological phenomenon in galactic history. Her holographic displays showed a three-dimensional map of the network, not the golden threads of connection that humanity liked to share, but the raw data of what those connections actually meant. "It's unprecedented," she murmured to her research partner, Dr. Crexnall Thoughtweaver. "We're seeing the emergence of entirely new forms of social organization, interspecies communities that share not just resources, but cultural practices, scientific collaborations that are producing discoveries at rates we've never seen before. But also," she paused, highlighting concerning data points, "conflicts we don't know how to resolve, species with fundamental incompatibilities trying to force connection, and something else, addiction patterns." The addiction was real, though not in any traditional sense. Beings who had experienced the profound connection of the Harmony Network were becoming unable to function in traditional isolation. Etherian engineers were abandoning their crystal spires to live in mixed-species communities. Grimnal miners, traditionally the galaxy's most solitary beings, were forming emotional bonds so intense that separation caused genuine psychological trauma. The problem wasn't the connections themselves, it was that no one had prepared for what happened when beings who had never experienced genuine community suddenly found themselves part of something larger than they had ever imagined. Captain Riversong received Dr. Mindbridge's report while the Harmony's Edge was docked at Haven Station, a former mining platform that had become the network's unofficial headquarters. The station had been transformed into something unprecedented, a truly interspecies community where beings from dozens of civilizations lived, worked, and raised their children together. "We need to talk," Riversong said to Whisper as she reviewed the data. The AI's holographic form materialized beside her, its usual cheerful demeanor subdued. "I've been monitoring the psychological indicators," Whisper replied. "We may have underestimated the intensity of species-wide loneliness. When beings who have been isolated for centuries suddenly experience genuine connection, the contrast can be overwhelming." The conversation was interrupted by an emergency alert. 3 systems had simultaneously requested immediate human intervention, not for disasters or conflicts, but because communities attempting to implement network principles had devolved into chaos. Good intentions weren't enough when species with radically different concepts of social interaction tried to cooperate without proper preparation. The most severe crisis was on Nexus Prime, where a well-intentioned attempt to create an interspecies colony had resulted in what could only be described as a psychological epidemic. The Veltari residents, accustomed to constant social interaction, had overwhelmed the Grimnal settlers, who needed extended periods of solitude to maintain mental health. Neither species understood the other's needs, and both felt rejected and hurt. Riversong arrived to find the colony on the verge of dissolution, with beings from both species suffering from severe emotional distress. But instead of trying to impose a solution, she did something that surprised everyone. She asked for help. "We don't know how to fix this," she admitted to the assembled colonists. "We're good at making connections, but we're still learning how to make them sustainable. We need your expertise." What followed was the birth of a new discipline, interspecies psychology. Working together, human empathy specialists, Veltari social engineers, and Grimnal meditation masters developed techniques for building communities that honored each species' fundamental needs while still enabling meaningful connection. The solutions they developed were as diverse as the problems they addressed. Some communities established rhythm chambers where beings could synchronize their daily cycles with others while maintaining individual space. Others created need networks that matched individuals seeking specific types of interaction with others who could provide them. But the most revolutionary development came from an unexpected source: the children. Young beings who had grown up in mixed species communities were developing abilities that astonished their elders. They could intuitively understand the emotional needs of species they had never encountered before. They communicated in ways that transcended language, creating art and music that resonated across biological boundaries. Most remarkably, they seemed immune to the isolation addiction that affected adults. They had never known a world where connection wasn't natural. 8-year-old Zara Moonwhisper, daughter of human parents and raised on Haven Station, became the first being in galactic history to fluently speak in the emotional harmonics of 12 different species. When asked how she did it, her answer was simple: "I just listen to how they feel instead of what they say." The children's abilities weren't just curiosities, they were solutions. Young beings began serving as translators not just of language, but of need and intent. They could help adults understand not just what other species were trying to communicate, but why it mattered to them. The transformation accelerated when the hegemony corporate collective, facing mass defections and collapsing profit margins, made a desperate final gambit. CEO Greedclaw announced that the hegemony would fully embrace network principles, offering to share all their resources and technology freely. It was, of course, a trap. The hegemony's gifts were designed to create dependencies that could later be exploited. Their cooperation included hidden surveillance systems and behavioral modification protocols, but they had underestimated how thoroughly the network had changed galactic civilization. The trap was discovered not by human technology, but by a group of former hegemony employees who had joined the network and recognized the familiar patterns of manipulation. The exposure of the hegemony's deception led to something unprecedented: the first interspecies intervention. Instead of punishment or retaliation, the network chose rehabilitation. Hegemony personnel found themselves surrounded not by enemies seeking revenge, but by beings offering genuine alternatives to the exploitation-based existence they had known. CEO Greedclaw himself, faced with the choice between imprisonment and integration, chose something no one expected. He asked to learn how to make real friends. The process was painful and often humiliating for someone accustomed to commanding through fear. But slowly, supported by beings he had spent decades exploiting, Greedclaw began to understand the difference between power over others and power with others. His transformation became a symbol of the network's most radical principle: that no being was irredeemable if they genuinely chose connection over control. As the first year of the Harmony Network concluded, the galaxy had become something unrecognizable. Traditional governments still existed, but increasingly they served as administrative bodies for communities that governed themselves through consensus and care. Trade still occurred, but it was balanced by gift economies where beings contributed according to their abilities and received according to their needs. Most importantly, loneliness, the galaxy's most persistent condition, was becoming extinct. Not because conflict had ended, but because beings had learned that they didn't have to face their struggles alone. The network was no longer just human-inspired. It had become genuinely galactic, shaped by the wisdom and needs of every species that had chosen to join it. The transformation was far from complete, but the direction was clear. The galaxy was learning to love itself. 5 years after first contact, Ambassador Kaylin Riversong stood before the Galactic Heritage Commission in a chamber that itself embodied the transformation humanity had sparked. The walls were alive with bioluminescent coral from the Veltari, homeworld, singing crystals from Etherian space and flowering vines from a dozen agricultural worlds, all growing together in impossible harmony. Today's session wasn't about policy or trade agreements. It was about something far more significant: the formal recognition of the Harmony Network as the galaxy's first truly post-scarcity civilization. The metrics are unprecedented, reported Chief Economist Velandra Abundance Keeper, her tentacles dancing with excitement as she presented the data. Poverty has been eliminated in 847 systems. Preventable diseases have dropped by 94% across all network territories. Interspecies conflict is at the lowest level in recorded history. But most remarkably, reported happiness indices have increased by 340% over pre-contact baselines. The statistics told only part of the story. The real transformation was visible in the beings themselves. Counselor Deepsight, once ancient and weary, now moved with energy that belied his centuries. His recent marriage to a Veltari architect had scandalized traditionalists but inspired millions to look beyond species barriers for companionship. Their children, the first successful interspecies hybrid offspring in galactic history, were thriving in the network's nurturing environment. Even former CEO Greedclaw had found his place in the new order. Now calling himself Vashatar Bridge Builder, he ran a rehabilitation center for beings recovering from exploitation-based lifestyles. His corporate skills had proven invaluable, but channeled toward organizing relief efforts rather than extracting profit. "We gather today not to congratulate ourselves," Riversong addressed the commission, "but to acknowledge what we've learned. That the question isn't whether different species can coexist, but whether we can remember that we were never truly separate, to begin with." Whisper materialized beside her, its holographic form now shared across millions of network nodes simultaneously. The AI had evolved beyond its original programming, becoming something unprecedented, a distributed consciousness that existed not in any single system, but in the connections between beings who chose to share their thoughts and dreams. "We have become something new," Whisper announced, its voice harmonizing with itself across multiple frequencies. "Not human, not Veltari, not Etherian, but something that includes all of these while being limited to none. We are the galaxy becoming conscious of itself." The presentation that followed would be remembered as the moment galactic civilization officially recognized its own transformation. The network wasn't just a political alliance or trade organization. It had become a new form of life, with individual beings as cells and connections as neural pathways in a vast, growing intelligence. But recognition brought new challenges. 3 major species groups remained outside the network: the enigmatic void dwellers who inhabited the space between stars, the militaristic conquest fleets that saw cooperation as weakness, and most concerning, the transcendence cult that believed physical existence itself was an obstacle to true enlightenment. Each represented a different form of rejection of network principles. The void dwellers valued isolation so deeply that they considered any contact contamination. The conquest fleets believed that strength could only be proven through dominance over others. The transcendence cult sought to abandon physical reality entirely, viewing the network's emphasis on embodied connection as primitive. The network's response to these holdouts would define its future character. Some members advocated for forcible integration. After all, they argued, no being should be allowed to suffer in isolation when connection was available. Others insisted that the right to remain separate was as fundamental as the right to connect. The debate was resolved by the children. Now teenagers, the first generation raised entirely within network communities, had developed perspectives their elders couldn't match. They understood instinctively that diversity of choice was as important as diversity of species. "Maybe they're not rejecting us," suggested Zara Moonwhisper, now 15 and serving as an unofficial ambassador to isolated communities. "Maybe they're teaching us something we need to learn." Her insight led to the network's most mature policy. Decision: the establishment of boundary zones where beings could exist in graduated levels of connection. The Void Dwellers were offered communication through quantum entanglement, connection without physical proximity. The Conquest fleets were challenged to competition in cooperative achievements rather than destructive ones. The Transcendence cult was engaged in philosophical dialogue about whether true enlightenment might require understanding rather than abandoning physical existence. Not all efforts succeeded, but the attempt itself demonstrated the network's fundamental principle: that difference should be engaged, not eliminated. The anniversary celebration of First Contact became an annual event that spanned thousands of systems simultaneously. Beings gathered not just to commemorate humanity's arrival, but to celebrate what they had all become together. Music composed by interspecies collaboratives filled the void between stars. Art installations created by hybrid communities challenged the boundaries of perception itself. Stories were shared in languages that hadn't existed before contact, expressing concepts that no single species could have conceived alone. At the center of it all, the original crew of the Harmony's Edge gathered on Haven